Hello everyone, welcome back to GraveTales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. I want you to leave a comment on where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, be sure to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get into tonight's stories. Story 1. I still remember the morning it happened, the exact way it started. It was a Thursday, a little after 7 a.m. The sun wasn't all the way up yet, and the house was quiet. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee, scrolling through my phone the way I always do before work. Most mornings, the news feed is full of the usual stuff. Local weather updates, sports scores, stories about city council meetings I'll never attend. But that morning, one headline stopped. Me cold, local high school teacher arrested in connection with multiple murders. At first, I almost scrolled past it. I figured it was about some school in another county, maybe a place I'd never even heard of or called. But then my eyes caught on the name, Harlan Keller. I read it twice. My heart seemed to skip a beat and then speed up to make up for it. But that name wasn't just familiar, it was personal. Harlan Keller had been my history teacher back in high school. And not just any teacher. He was one of those rare ones who could keep a classroom quiet without raising his voice. He was the kind of teacher you actually remembered after graduation because he had a way of making the smallest facts sound important. He was calm, collected, and, honestly, kind of cool. Okay? In that way, certain teachers are when they treat you like you're smarter than you are. The article was short, but it was enough to make my stomach twist. Police had searched his home after receiving credible information. Inside, they'd found what they were calling evidence connected to multiple homicide cases from recent years. T didn't say much else, but there was one line, just one, that kept ringing in my head. Investigators also recovered a series of photographs depicting unidentified individuals believed to be victims. Photographs. The word stuck with me. Keller was always carrying a camera. Back in high school, he'd been in charge of the photography club. Even if you weren't in the club, you knew about it because he was always snapping pictures, landscapes, old buildings, even candid shots of students. Okay, he'd bring in prints sometimes and pin them to the classroom bulletin board. Back then, I thought it was harmless. Quirky, sure, but harmless. Now, reading that article, my brain started digging up little memories I hadn't thought about in years. The rest of that morning passed in a blur. I don't think I even finished my coffee. Just sat there, staring at my phone, scrolling through. Every article I could find about Keller, each one had the same photo of him, the same face I remembered from the classroom. His hair had gone a little more gray, but the expression was the same. Calm, almost. UNBOTHER. It didn't seem real. How could it be real? This was someone who once helped me with my college recommendation letters. Someone who stayed late after school to help students study for finals. Someone who, when the yearbook photographer was out sick, offered to take our class picture himself. The idea that he could be connected to something as dark as murder, it didn't fit, or at least I didn't think it did. At that moment, I didn't know that I was about to see something that would make the whole thing feel a lot more real, okay? And I definitely didn't know that some of those photographs the police found might be taken in places I'd been to before, places I'd stood years earlier without knowing. When I think back on my time in high school, Mr. Keller stands out in a way that very few teachers do. And not just because of what's happened now, but because even then he had a presence that was hard to ignore, tall but not imposing. It's a kind of person who never had to raise his voice to get a room full of restless teenagers to settle down. He would just stand at the front of the classroom with that calm expression, one hand resting on the edge of his desk, and wait until everyone was quiet, as if he knew we'd give him our attention eventually. His teaching style was different, too, more like storytelling than lecturing, weaving historical events into personal anecdotes and odd bits of trivia that made you feel like you were being let in on a secret, even when the topic was something most of us found boring. Okay, like agricultural reforms in the 1800s. Okay, he'd find a way to tie it to something modern or something that had happened in our own town's history. What, at the time, made him seem like someone deeply invested in his students' learning. Outside of class, he was heavily involved in the photography club, which I joined my junior year, not because I was particularly good with the camera, but because it was one of the few clubs where you could take weekend trips and get out of the building. He organized hikes, visits to old buildings, abandoned train stations, empty grain silos, okay? All under the guise of learning how to capture texture and light, okay? And he always brought his own camera, a bulky old film model that hung from a wide leather strap around his neck, the kind of camera that clicked loudly when the shutter closed. He had an eye for framing shots, and he'd often show us how to stand or angle ourselves so the background looked more interesting, sometimes asking us to step just a little farther back into the trees or a little closer to a weathered fence, saying things like, "Now, that's perfect. Hold it there for just a second before taking the shot." We never questioned it because we trusted him. He was our teacher, the adult in charge, and besides, everyone liked Mr. Keller, even the students who didn't like school in general. He had this dry sense of humor that caught people off guard, cracking jokes under his breath that only the kids in the front row could hear. And he remembered small details about people's lives, like what sports they played, what their siblings' names were, or where they'd gone on vacation last summer. Sometimes he'd bring in baked goods his sister had made and leave them on the desk for anyone to take, something no other teacher did. Looking back, I realized that all of these little things painted him as approachable, even safe, and it's unsettling now to think about how much we trusted him, how comfortable we were in his presence, because, at the time, none of us could have imagined that the same man who led us through winding forest trails and crumbling factory ruins with a camera in his hands might have had another reason for choosing those places, one that had nothing to do with art or history, and everything to do with secrets we wouldn't learn about until years later, when the photographs found in his home made their way into the news. The rest of that day, I couldn't get the news story out of my head, no matter how many times I told myself to focus on work or think about something else, because every time I glanced at my phone, I'd see the same headline, the same mugshot of Mr. Keller with that calm, unreadable face, okay? And I'd end up reading the articles again like I was looking for some hidden detail I'd missed the first time. Later that evening, after dinner, I sat on my couch with the TV on low, half listening to the local news anchor repeat the same information I'd already read online. But then they cut to a segment that showed a few blurred images of what police were calling possible crime scene photographs found in Keller's possession. They didn't show any people in the shots, and most of the image was blurred out to avoid showing anything sensitive. But what caught me off guard was the background of one of them, because even though it was partially out of focus, I felt this strange pull of recognition. The same way you might feel when you see an old street from your childhood or a building you haven't thought about in years. It was just a sliver of scenery, maybe the corner of an old wooden fence in a patch of overgrown grass. But something about it looked familiar in a way I couldn't ignore. At first I thought maybe it was just because our town has plenty of rundown places like that. But then I noticed the way the light hit the fence, angled in exactly the same way, remembered from an old photography club trip during my junior year, a trip Mr. Keller had organized to a hiking spot just outside of town. We'd walked for hours through the woods before stopping near an old fence line that marked the edge of some long abandoned property. And I remembered him making a big deal about how natural framing could make a photograph feel more alive. Standing there in my living room, I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that there was no way I could recognize the location from a half-blurred photo on the evening news, especially after so many years. But that uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. It was the same prickling sensation I get when I'm sure I've forgotten something important. A little itch in the back of my brain that keeps telling me to look closer. So I did. I rewound the news clip, paused it right on the frame with the blurred photo, studied every corner of it, tracing the faint lines of the fence, the slant of the hill, the way the weeds curled at the base of the posts, and the more I looked, the more I felt certain that I had stood in that exact spot before. Maybe even posed for a photo there myself, with Mr. Keller behind the camera. It was the first time I felt something I didn't want to admit out loud. The thought that maybe this wasn't just a coincidence, and that if one location matched, there could be others. I told myself I wasn't going to keep obsessing over it, that I'd seen enough news for one night, and that the smart thing to do was to turn off the TV, wash the dishes, and get ready for bed, okay? But instead, I found myself sitting back down on the couch with my phone in hand, pulling up every article and news clip I could find about the case, scrolling through them like there was some missing piece I was supposed to find. Most of the coverage was repetitive, rehashing the same bullet points: the arrest, the search warrant, the undisclosed evidence, but buried in one of the later segments from a smaller local station. They showed a series of still images, all blurred in parts, and one of them made my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with imagination. It wasn't just a feeling of familiarity anymore. It was recognition, sharp and undeniable, the kind that makes your stomach drop because you know you've been there. You've seen that exact place with your own eyes. It was a wide shot of an open field with a tree line in the distance, and even though the faces of the people in it were obscured, the background wasn't completely hidden in the far right corner of the frame. I could see a weathered wooden sign tilted slightly to one side with a faint outline where old painted letters had once been. I knew that sign. I knew it because during my junior year, Mr. Keller had taken our photography club to that exact field, telling us it was a great example of natural contrast and insisting we each take a few shots with the sign in the background. I even remembered the way the field had smelled faintly of wet hay that day, and how Keller had wandered off toward the tree line while the rest of us stayed near the road, snapping photos of each other, pretending to be models. I remembered laughing with my friend Jamie about how Keller seemed to vanish sometimes on these trips, curing into the distance until you almost forgot he was with us at all, only to reappear with a satisfied look on his face like he'd found exactly what he'd been looking for. Now, staring at that blurry photo on my phone screen, all of those small, harmless-seeming memories started to feel different, heavier somehow, like there was something hiding inside them I hadn't noticed at the time. I thought about how easy it would have been for him to go back to these places alone. He knew the routes. He knew when they were empty. He knew how to get there without drawing attention, and the thought made my skin crawl. I didn't want to believe it, didn't want to connect the man who once handed out extra credit assignments and baked goods to the man being described in the news. But the match was too exact to ignore, and once I realized that, I couldn't stop wondering how many other photos in that stack might show places I knew, places I had stood, smiling for a camera I had trusted, without any idea what else that camera might have seen. That night, I barely slept, not because of nightmares, but because my mind wouldn't stop replaying that image of the field and the sign. It's like it was on a loop in my head, refusing to fade, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized I had to be sure. I had to prove to myself that I wasn't just imagining these connections. So the next morning, instead of doing anything productive, I pulled an old plastic storage bin out of the back of my closet, the one I hadn't touched in years, the one full of yearbooks, old notebooks, and random things I'd kept from high school without really knowing why. The bin smelled faintly of dust and something like old paper, and the sound of the lid snapping open felt louder than it should have in my quiet apartment. I sat cross-legged on the floor and started digging, pulling out my junior year yearbook, stacks of printed photos in cheap paper envelopes, and even a battered photo album my mom had given me after graduation. the one that had a mix of school events and family gatherings. At first, I flipped through without much direction, just looking for any sign of those photography club trips, and there they were. Dozens of pictures I hadn't looked at in over a decade. Group shots of us lined up in front of crumbling brick walls, posed in patches of sunlight under tree canopies, or leaning against rusted metal railings. Started studying the backgrounds more than the people, and almost right away spotted something that made my heart race. A photo of me and two friends standing on a hiking trail with a tall wire fence behind us, its metal posts bent in exactly the same way I'd seen in another blurred news image the night before. I pulled out more stacks of photos, my hands moving faster now, flipping through image after image, and I began noticing patterns I'd never thought about before. The locations weren't random at all. They were mostly isolated, quiet places far from town, the kind of places where you could spend hours without seeing another person. And Keller seemed to have a particular fondness for spots with some kind of abandoned structure, an old barn, a boarded-up cabin, a collapsed silo, all of which had seemed harmless to us back then, just cool and mysterious in a teenage adventure sort of way. But now, looking at them in the context of what I knew, they felt like something else entirely, like he'd been cataloging them, keeping them in his mind for reasons I didn't want to guess. I noticed, too, that Keller himself was rarely in the photos unless it was a group shot someone else had taken, which meant that most of the time he was behind the camera, deciding exactly what was captured and what wasn't. I sat there for hours, surrounded by scattered photos and open yearbooks, my phone on the floor beside me as I kept pausing to cross-reference things, a tree line here, a broken fence there, with screenshots I'd taken of the blurred images from the news. I found at least 3 locations that I was almost certain matched, down to the angle of the hill or the shape of a building's roof, and with each match, the air in my apartment seemed to get heavier, as if the walls were closing in a little. Part of me wanted to stop, to shove everything back in the bin and pretend I hadn't seen the connections. But another part of me, the louder part, needed to know just how deep this went. By the time the sun was setting, my living room floor looked like a crime scene of its own, covered in scattered photographs, some lying face down like they didn't want to be looked at. And I sat in the middle of it all, feeling like I had just stumbled into a story I didn't want to be part of, couldn't walk away from, because I was beginning to realize that if I had been to these places before, maybe I had been closer to whatever Keller was doing than I'd ever realized. It's funny how certain memories can sit in the back of your mind for years, almost forgotten, until something shakes them loose and they come rushing back with so much clarity it feels like you're reliving them. And as I sat, surrounded by the mess of photographs on my floor, I felt one of those memories pushing its way forward. A memory I hadn't thought about in over a decade. It was from one of the early photography club trips my junior year. A cold, overcast Saturday in late fall when the trees were mostly bare and the ground was soft from recent rain. There were maybe 8 of us in the group that day, and Keller had taken us to a trail I'd never been to before, saying it was off the beaten path and perfect for finding unique textures. I remember the smell of wet leaves and the sound of our shoes squelching in the mud as we followed him deeper into the woods, the air so still that even our chatter seemed too loud. At some point, we reached a small clearing where the trail split in 2. One path sloping down toward a stream and the other winding upward into thicker woods, and while the rest of the group stayed near the stream to take photos of the water, Keller asked me to come with him up the hill because he wanted to show me something worth capturing. I followed without thinking much of it. He was my teacher, after all, and we walked for what felt like 10 minutes, far enough that I could no longer hear the rest of the group. Eventually, we stopped at the edge of a small drop-off where the earth fell away into a shallow ravine, the sides covered in tangled roots and moss. Hand Keller stood there quietly for a moment before turning to me and asking in a tone that was casual but somehow unsettling, Have you ever been truly lost in the woods? I remember laughing nervously and saying something like, "Not really. I'm not the outdoors type, okay?" But instead of laughing back, he just studied me for a few seconds, his head tilted slightly, before saying, "It's a strange feeling. You start out thinking you can find your way back, but the longer you wander, the more you realize how small you are out here, and how no one would even know where to start looking for you at the time." I brushed it off as one of his weird philosophical comments. He was known for dropping strange little statements like that, especially on these trips. But now, replaying the moment in my head, I noticed details I hadn't paid attention to back then, like the way his eyes seemed to scan the tree line as he spoke, or how he positioned himself between me and the trail back down, or how he didn't take a single photo while we were up there. After a minute or so, he motioned for us to head back, and when we rejoined the group, he acted as if nothing had happened, making jokes and giving tips on how to frame shots of moving water. I'd almost forgotten the whole thing until now, but seeing those locations in the news and matching them to my old photos made that conversation feel heavier, like it had been less about photography and more about testing something. Maybe my reaction would be how far I was willing to follow him. I sat on my living room floor that night, with that memory replaying over and over, my hands resting on a stack of photos I suddenly didn't want to touch, wondering how many other moments from those trips I'd dismissed as harmless quirks, but were actually pieces of something much darker I hadn't recognized at the time. Once that memory of the conversation came back, it was like opening a floodgate I couldn't close, 'cause suddenly I wasn't just looking at the photographs for familiar landmarks. I was remembering smells, sounds, the way the air felt on those trips, and I started combing through the stacks on my floor with a kind of focus I didn't know I was capable of, pulling aside any photo that even remotely resembled the blurred images I'd seen on the news. I had my laptop open, 2 freeze frames from the coverage, my phone in one hand, a pen in the other to jot down dates and details. And as the hours went by, I realized I was starting to build my own sort of map without meaning to, a map of all the places Keller had taken us and all the places that could, maybe, match what was in those police photos. One shot from the news had what looked like the corner of a rusted metal staircase, and after digging for almost half an hour, I found an old photo of my friend, Jamie, standing on a spiral staircase outside an abandoned grain mill. Same rust patterns, same weeds growing through the cracked pavement below, and I remembered how Keller had led us there one cloudy afternoon, saying it was a hidden piece of local history that hardly anyone knew about, and how he had taken his time photographing the building from different angles while the rest of us stayed in the parking lot. Another news image showed a faint outline of a slanted roof with a broken window, and I recognized it almost instantly as the old boarding house on the outskirts of town that we'd visited one summer. I had a picture of myself sitting on the porch steps, my sneakers covered in dust, with Keller just out of frame holding his camera. The more matches I found, the more the pit in my stomach grew, because I was starting to see that these weren't just random spots we'd stumbled across on our outings. They were secluded, easy to access without attracting attention, and all of them had some kind of structure that offered shelter from view. As the daylight outside my apartment faded into evening, the glow from my laptop screen made the photos in my hands look colder, sharper, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was staring at the early stages of something that maybe these trips had been practice runs for him, a way to scout locations under the cover of a school activity. I even started to notice small details in the way Keller would stand in certain group photos, like how he'd always position himself with the background he liked behind him, almost as if he were testing how it would look in a frame. It hit me that these matches weren't coincidences, there were too many, The similarities too specific, and the realization made my chest feel tight, like I was in the middle of something I shouldn't be part of, but couldn't stop looking at. By the time I finally leaned back and looked at the floor around me, I had a dozen photos in a separate pile marked with sticky notes. each one corresponding to a location I was certain I'd seen in the evidence released by the news. And in that moment, I knew that if I didn't go see one of those places in person, I'd never be able to quiet the voice in my head telling me I needed to be sure, not just about Keta, but about what had been right in front of me all those years ago. I didn't sleep much that night, and by morning I decided that if I kept sitting in my apartment, staring at these old photos, I'd end up driving myself crazy. So I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Jamie's number. We hadn't spoken in over a year, maybe longer, but the thought of calling him made more sense than trying to involve anyone else yet, because Jamie had been there on a lot of those trips. He'd seen the same places, breathed the same dusty air, and maybe he'd remember things I didn't. The phone rang 3 times before he picked up, his voice groggy like I'd woken him, and at first he seemed surprised to hear from me, even making a little joke about how I only called when I needed something. But when I mentioned Keller's name, the joking stopped and his tone shifted in a way I didn't like. It went flat, careful, almost like he was checking who might be listening on his end. I asked him if he'd been following the news, and he said, yeah, in that clipped way that told me he didn't want to talk about it over the phone. So I said we should meet in person, somewhere quiet, and after a pause, he suggested the diner, near the highway, the one with the red vinyl booths and the flickering sign, where we used to go after basketball games. I got there early and sat in the corner booth, watching the door every time it swung open, till finally Jamie walked in, wearing a hooded sweatshirt with the hood up, even though it wasn't cold, okay? And when he slid into the booth, his eyes kept darting toward the windows like he expected someone to follow him. I didn't waste time. I pulled out my pile of printed photos from the old trips, spreading them on the table, and pointed to the ones I thought matched the crime scene shots from the news. Jamie didn't touch them, just leaned forward to look, and after a long silence, he said, yeah. I thought I was crazy for thinking that too, which made the hair on my arms stand up. He told me he'd noticed the same thing, certain buildings, empty lots, even a back road with a rusted guardrail, and that some of those spots had felt off even back then, like Keller was watching something we couldn't see. I pressed him for details, and that's when he told me about a time during one of our trips when Keller had asked him to help carry something heavy from his car trunk to a shed near the river. Jamie never saw what was inside the box, just that it was taped shut and smelled faintly like chemicals, and Keller had told him not to drop it because it was delicate. The memory had stuck with him for years because afterward, Keller had gone into the shed alone and locked the door for almost 20 minutes while the rest of us waited by the van. I could feel my pulse in my ears listening to him because it was the first time anyone else had given me a concrete reason to think Keller's trips weren't just harmless field outings. Then Jamie leaned in lower and said there was something else, something he'd kept in the shoebox in his closet since high school, and before I could ask what it was, he slid a folded piece of paper across the table. I unfolded it and found an old Polaroid photo, slightly faded, showing what looked like a patch of dirt with a torn piece of fabric sticking out. And in the corner of the frame was Keller's shadow, long and clear in the afternoon sun. Jamie whispered that Keller had taken that picture with Jamie's camera by mistake during one of their hikes. And when Jamie developed it later, he'd been too unsettled to throw it away, but too scared to show anyone. I stared at the photo for so long, the diner noise around us blurred into nothing, and all I could think was that this wasn't just a bad feeling anymore. This was proof, or at least the closest thing to it we were likely to get without going straight to the police. But neither of us seemed ready to take that step yet, because saying it out loud to someone official would make it all real. Okay, and I wasn't sure either of us was ready for what that would mean. Jamie didn't want to go back at first, and honestly, neither did I. But once that old Polaroid was sitting on my kitchen table under the dim yellow light, The image of that patch of dirt with the fabric sticking out burned into my brain. It became impossible to ignore. So 2 nights later, when the rain had let up, but the clouds still hung low like a heavy lid over the town, we drove out to the river, taking the same cracked road we'd driven in high school. Only now the guardrail looked even more rusted. The paint peeled completely away in places. The whole area swallowed by overgrown brush, and the air had that faint metallic smell rivers sometimes have in summer. The shed was still there, squatting at the edge of the bank. Its wood warped and blackened from age, the padlock on the door orange with rust, and I felt a jolt in my chest just seeing it again, 'cause in my memory this place had been nothing more than a pit stop. Somewhere Keller told us to wait while he checked something, but now it loomed like the center of a puzzle we hadn't known we were solving. Jamie parked the car far back, out of sight from the road, and we trudged through the wet grass, every step making that damp, squelching sound that seemed way too loud in the stillness. When we got close enough, I could see that the door frame was slightly warped on one side, just enough to slip a hand in. The lock itself was useless now. One firm push, and it would probably fall right off, but neither of us moved for a long moment, just staring at that gap, the night air cold enough to make my fingertips ache. Finally, Jamie took out a flashlight and handed it to me, uttering something about you first with a nervous half smile that didn't reach his eyes. And I stepped forward, put my shoulder into the door, and felt the wood give with a sharp crack. The smell hit first, musty, damp, and underneath it, something sharper, faint, but enough to make my stomach twist. And then the beam of the flashlight cut across the inside, showing piles of old tarps, stacked paint cans, and a half-collapsed workbench. At first, it looked empty, like maybe this whole thing had been in our heads. But then, Jamie crouched near the far corner, brushing aside a heap of rotted fabric, and I heard him suck in a breath. Under the fabric was a wooden crate, smaller than I expected, nailed shut, its surface stained dark in places. I shined the light on it and saw a faint black marker on one side, just the letter K, followed by a date I couldn't make out. We didn't speak, because saying anything might make it feel like a decision point. Like once we opened it, there'd be no going back. But I could tell by Jamie's face that he was already thinking the same thing I was, that whatever was inside had been there for years. And if Keller had gone to this much trouble to keep it hidden, it wasn't going to be anything good. I knelt down beside him, found a loose corner on the crate's lid, started prying at it with the end of a rusted paint scraper I'd found leaning against the wall. The nails screamed softly as they lifted, the sound far too loud in the silence, until finally the lid popped free inside. There were layers of black plastic, tightly wrapped and taped. And as I peeled them back, the smell intensified, that sour chemical rat mix that makes your brain want to reject it immediately. Under the last layer was fabric, maybe part of an old dress, stained and stiff, tangled around something solid. I pulled back just enough to see what looked like bone, small and pale, before the sight made my vision swim. Jamie swore under his breath and backed away, and for a long moment we both just crouched there in the flashlight's cone, the crate gaping open like a wound, the air thick with the knowledge that we were looking at evidence of something far bigger and darker than we'd guessed. My first instinct was to close it, to cover it back up and pretend we hadn't seen. But then another thought came. If we walked away now, this would just sit here another decade, maybe forever, and Keller would stay what he'd always been, in the public's memory, eccentric, quiet, harmless. I looked at Jamie, ready to say we should take it straight to the police. But his face had gone pale and tight, and instead he said in a low voice that someone might have followed us because he thought he'd seen headlights back near the turnoff. We froze, listening. The only sounds the river moving slow and heavy nearby, and the wind sliding through the grass, until faintly, just faintly, there came the crunch of footsteps outside, moving toward the shed. The moment we heard those footsteps crunching closer through the wet grass, everything inside me went rigid, like a wire pulled tight. Jamie and I exchanged a quick, panicked glance, and without saying a word, we both understood what had to happen. We had to hide and stay silent. The shed wasn't big, but it had a narrow crawl space beneath the workbench. It's barely enough for 2 adults to squeeze into, so we dropped low, trying not to make a sound as the cold, damp dirt pressed against my cheek and the scent of mildew filled my nose. The flashlight lay on the floor beside us, its beam pointed toward the open crate. The thing we'd uncovered moments before, now an unwanted beacon in the dark. I could hear Jamie's breath, shallow and fast next to me, matching my own, while outside the footsteps slowed, then stopped just beyond the door, and for what felt like hours, we stayed frozen. Every nerve screaming, every tiny noise amplified in the silence. I could hear the faint rustle of clothing, a low voice murmuring something I couldn't quite make out, words clipped and urgent, like someone on edge, and I thought about how close we were to whoever it was, how easily they could open the door and find us here. But the lock was old, and the door didn't budge. The person moved away from the shed slowly, his footsteps crunching again, but retreating now, fading into the night like a ghost slipping away. Only when the sound was gone did Jamie let out a breath he'd been holding, and I felt my muscles finally unclench, but the tension stayed thick in the air like smoke. We stayed in that cramped space for what must have been another 15 minutes, whispering plans and hushed voices, deciding that we couldn't stay there any longer and that we needed to get out before whoever it was came back with more people. When we finally crawled out, the night was quiet again, the river murmuring softly nearby and the sky blanketed in clouds. But the shed felt different, like it was watching us as we slipped back through the weeds and toward the car. The drive home was silent except for the hum of the engine, both of us lost in our own thoughts. And when I got back to my apartment, I locked every door and window twice, pulled the curtains tight, and sat with the photo of the crate still fresh in my mind, realizing that we had just stepped into a nightmare that was far from over, and that Mr. Keller's secrets were darker and more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. After that night, everything felt different. My apartment, the streets outside, even the quiet hum of my own thoughts, because I was caught in the middle of something I couldn't just walk away from, but also couldn't fully face without fear creeping into every corner of my mind. I spent hours pacing back and forth, staring at the old Polaroid Jamie had given me and the pictures spread out on my floor, feeling the weight of what we'd found pressing down like a stone in my chest. And every time I thought about calling the police, the memory of those footsteps outside the shed came back, raw and immediate, reminding me that someone else knew we were poking around, that maybe someone was watching me right now, just beyond the window. Part of me wanted to scream, to tell someone, anyone, but I also knew how hard it would be to convince the authorities that a former teacher, someone so well respected in the community, could be capable of what we suspected, and that without concrete proof, we'd just be seen as conspiracy theorists, or worse, troublemakers stirring up old ghosts. The news reports had been vague, almost clinical, carefully avoiding details that might alarm the public, and I wondered if the police themselves didn't have enough evidence to act, or if they were just waiting for something else to fall into place. I thought about Keller, the man who had once stood at the front of our classroom, patient and kind, and how all of those memories, once so comforting, were now twisted, tainted by what we'd uncovered, and the idea that he might have been hiding this double life all along was almost too much to hold. I called Jamie again that night, and we talked for hours in low voices, weighing the risks and the options. Neither of us wanting to make a move that might put us in danger, but also knowing that doing nothing wasn't really an option either. Eventually, we agreed that the best thing to do was to keep gathering information quietly, to try to find more locations or evidence that would make the story undeniable, something we could bring to the police that they couldn't ignore or dismiss. But even saying that out loud felt like stepping onto a tightrope stretched over a dark abyss with no safety net below. I also started thinking about how this was no longer just about me or Jamie. It was about the people whose lives had been shattered, the victims whose faces we might never fully see, and the families who deserved answers. And even if those answers were terrifying, they had to be found. I spent the next few days going through old local news archives online, searching for any unsolved cases or missing persons reports that might connect to the locations we'd identified. And although some of the details were vague, patterns started to emerge, dark threads weaving through the quiet town history that no one had talked about before. By the end of the week, I knew that I couldn't keep this to myself anymore, but the question of when, how, and to whom I would tell it was a burden that pressed on me like a shadow I couldn't shake. The more time I spent digging through old news archives, the more I felt like I was stepping into a shadow world beneath the surface of the town I thought I knew so well. At first, the search was slow and frustrating. Dozens of missing persons reports from the past 20 years. Many dismissed as runaways or accidents, many with little follow-up, and no obvious connections to Keller or the places we'd identified. But as I cross-referenced dates, locations, and victim descriptions, subtle patterns began to emerge, like faint outlines on a foggy window. Young people disappearing near those same abandoned spots we'd visited. Names and faces I'd never heard before, but who all seemed to vanish without a trace. Some of the reports described eerie details that made my skin crawl. A girl last seen near an old mill. A man who disappeared while hiking a trail we'd walked as a group. Another teenager who vanished after leaving a late-night party. The river and the timing of those disappearances lined up unsettlingly close to the years Keller had been our teacher. There were also whispers in old forum posts and local blogs, half-forgotten rumors about strange lights in the woods, unsettling noises near empty buildings, and even one mention of a mysterious figure seen lurking near a long-abandoned farmstead that matched one of Keller's favorite photography locations. Piecing this together felt like walking a tightrope over darkness, because every new connection added weight to what I was uncovering, but also pushed me deeper into a maze where the exit seemed further away with every step. Sometimes I'd find a victim's photo in a newspaper archive, grainy and faded, and I'd hold it up next to my own photos from those trips, searching for clues, a patch of ground, a bent fence post, a twisted tree branch, hoping for something that could prove Keller's presence at that time and place. But the hardest part wasn't just the facts. It was imagining the lives behind those missing faces. Their families left with nothing but questions and hope fading into silence. And realizing that the man I once trusted had likely been living a secret life that destroyed so many. I started writing everything down. Notes, timelines, cross-references, creating a file that grew every day. And as the pieces came together, the line between past and present blurred, making me feel like I was being watched, not just by the shadows in the news stories, but by something right here in the quiet corners of my own life. Despite the fear, I knew I had to keep going, because if I stopped now, I'll let this become just another forgotten tragedy I would be betraying. All those who never got a voice, and I couldn't live with that on my conscience. After days of poring over the archives and piecing together those heartbreaking patterns, I realized that I couldn't keep this information locked away anymore. The faces behind the missing persons reports were more than names on paper. They were real people with families who who had been waiting for answers for years. I wanted to help bring some light into that darkness, even if it was just a small flicker. So I started reaching out cautiously, sending messages to a few local reporters who had covered some of the old cases, hoping they might have more information or be interested in looking into the connections I had found. Some responded quickly. Some never replied at all, but one reporter named Lisa agreed to meet me at a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town, where she shared what she knew, how the cases had been frustratingly cold, with police often hitting dead ends because of lack of evidence or uncooperative witnesses, how the community had been reluctant to believe something sinister could be happening so close to home, and how Keller had flown under the radar because he was always polite and low-key, a fact that haunted her and made her wonder what might have been missed. Encouraged, I also messaged the families of a few victims whose contact info I found through public records. Some didn't respond. Some thanked me politely, but said they didn't want to reopen old wounds. But one mother, Mrs. Reynolds, called me back late one night, her voice trembling as she told me how her daughter Sarah had disappeared 10 years ago near the very same river where Jamie and I had found the shed. How she had never stopped looking for answers, and how hearing about the locations I had connected gave her a glimmer of hope that maybe, finally, something was moving forward. That phone call changed everything for me. Suddenly, this wasn't just an investigation or a mystery. It was a responsibility, and I felt the weight of it settle deep in my bones, because now every step I took wasn't just about uncovering Keller's secrets, but about honoring the lives that had been lost and the families still searching in silence. Over the next few weeks, Lisa and I exchanged information constantly, working to build a picture that was bigger and darker than either of us had imagined. And as I shared more photos and details, she started preparing a story that could finally bring this hidden nightmare to light. But with every breakthrough came new dangers, strange calls with silence on the other end, moments where I felt like I was being watched, and the persistent, knowing fear that Keller, or someone protecting him, still had eyes on me, waiting for a misstep. Despite that, I pushed forward, knowing that the truth had to come out, no matter how frightening it was, because if I didn't do it, then who would? Just as Lisa and I were starting to feel like we were making real progress, the situation took a sharp turn into something far more dangerous and unsettling, because the deeper we dug, the more we realized we were stepping on toes that didn't want to be stepped on. It started with subtle things, my phone buzzing with unknown numbers that went dead the moment I answered, strange cars parked outside my apartment that disappeared when I looked out the window, emails that seemed to come from nowhere, filled with empty threats or warnings cloaked in vague language meant to scare me without saying anything directly. The worst was when some of the files I'd painstakingly collected, photos, notes, cross-references, suddenly vanished from my computer, like someone had accessed it remotely and deleted them without a trace. And for a moment, I felt like everything we'd worked for was slipping through my fingers. I reached out to Lisa, and she told me she'd received calls from an anonymous source warning her to drop the story, and that some of her own research had been blocked by uncooperative sources or people who suddenly refused to talk. It was as if we touched a nerve, and the town itself seemed to close ranks, with old friends turning distant and familiar faces, avoiding me when I passed by. Even Jamie became more cautious, telling me he'd noticed strangers hanging around his neighborhood and that he'd changed his phone number without telling anyone. The fear was real, thick enough to taste, but so was the determination, because every time we faced a setback, it only made the story feel more urgent, more alive, like we were peeling back layers on something powerful and dangerous. Began to question who we could trust, whether the police were truly investigating or quietly protecting Keller, and how far this darkness reached into the community, and the answers were murky and frightening. One night, after a particularly threatening voicemail left on my phone, I sat alone in my apartment, trying to steady my shaking hands and remind myself why I was doing this, not just for the story, but for the victims who never got a chance to speak, and for the families still haunted by unanswered questions. That night, staring at the blinking cursor on a blank document where I planned to write the next update, I knew this wasn't just about uncovering a serial killer anymore. It was about shining a light on a secret world built on silence and fear, and the risk I was taking to expose it was greater than I'd ever imagined. Just when it felt like the walls were closing in and every lead had turned cold, the silence cracked open in a way that caught me completely off guard. Because, out of nowhere, a new message appeared in my inbox. One quiet evening, it was from someone calling themselves a friend, their words short but full of meaning, offering a tip about a hidden journal Keller had kept, one that might hold the key to understanding what had really happened in those abandoned places. And though the email was anonymous and the language cautious, I knew I couldn't ignore it. Reaching out through the carefully provided contact details, I arranged a meeting in a crowded cafe on the edge of town, somewhere public and safe. And when the person finally showed up, a woman who introduced herself only as Rachel, she looked exhausted, scared, but determined, and her hand shook slightly as she handed me a worn notebook filled with cramped handwriting, sketchy maps of the locations Keller had taken us to all those years ago. Reading through it later, I found entries that spoke of obsession, control, and a chilling detachment from the pain Keller caused, with dates and names that matched the missing persons I'd been researching. And more than once, mentions of keeping the past buried and no loose ends. The journal was like a dark mirror into Keller's mind, confirming suspicions and revealing new depths of his twisted plans. And, while it was terrifying, it also gave me something concrete to hold on to, something undeniable. Around the same time, Lisa called to tell me that a former police officer had contacted her privately, someone who had worked on early investigations and hinted that evidence had been deliberately withheld or lost, but who was now willing to talk, risking everything, to shed light on the cover-up. As these pieces started coming together, a cautious hope blossomed, fragile but real. And though I knew the road ahead would be dangerous and the truth hard to face, I felt a responsibility to keep pushing, to keep asking questions, and to finally give the victims and their families the answers they deserved. This break in the silence was just the beginning, a small light in a long, dark tunnel. But it was enough to keep me going when everything else felt like it was falling apart. Meeting with the former officer was a turning point I hadn't expected to come so soon. But as soon as I stepped into the dimly lit corner booth of the old diner where we'd agreed to meet, I could feel the weight of years of secrets hanging between us. The man's eyes flickering nervously as he slid into the seat across from me, his voice low and cautious as he began to explain how the investigation into Keller had been hamstrung from the start, how evidence had mysteriously disappeared, how witnesses had been intimidated or pressured into silence, and how a few key players in the police department had quietly decided that keeping Keller's reputation intact was more important than pursuing justice, a reality that left victims' families shattered and the community in the dark. He told me about the early suspicions that Keller might be involved, but how his calm demeanor and position as a teacher made it difficult for even his colleagues to believe the worst, and how several potential leads were buried or lost, sometimes through bureaucratic mistakes and other times through deliberate cover-ups. The officer shared stories of late-night stakeouts where nothing happened, files that were inexplicably locked away from investigators who wanted to press charges, revealing a level of corruption and fear that made me realize how deep this went and how dangerous it was for anyone trying to bring the truth to light. Despite all of that, he said he'd never stop trying in his own way, quietly collecting whatever scraps of information he could, and that meeting me, a civilian, following the story was his way of finally passing the torch, hoping that together we could break through the walls of silence and denial. The conversation left me shaken, but also determined, because it made clear that this wasn't just about Keller's crimes. It was about a system that had failed, those victims, and was still resisting change, and that the fight ahead would require more than just uncovering evidence, but exposing the rot at the heart of the institution. Leaving the diner that night, I felt a mix of fear and resolve, knowing that while we'd gained a powerful ally, we'd also painted a target on ourselves, and that every step closer to the truth was going to bring new challenges and threats, but also, hopefully, justice for those who had been denied it for so long. After my meeting with the former officer, the pieces of the story began to come together faster than I could have imagined. And Lisa and I found ourselves working late into the night, poring over documents, notes, and the chilling journal Keller had left behind, determined to craft a report that would finally expose the full extent of his crimes and the institutional failures that had let him slip through the cracks for so long. The pressure was immediate and intense. Anonymous emails turned into veiled threats, phone calls that went unanswered, and even a few unexpected visits from people who clearly weren't just casual onlookers, but were there to remind us that some secrets were meant to stay buried. Lisa's newsroom became a fortress with locked doors and whispered conversations, and even our closest allies started urging caution, warning us that pushing too hard could put us in real danger. Despite the fear, we refused to back down, because every victim, every family member deserved to know the truth, no matter how painful it was. And we believed that shining a light on the darkness was the only way to make sure Keller's legacy wouldn't continue to haunt our community. As we assembled the report, we faced technical challenges to missing files that should have been there, conflicting testimonies, and sources that suddenly went silent, all signs that someone was working behind the scenes to stop us. But instead of deterring us, it fueled our resolve. I found myself walking a tightrope between exposing the truth and protecting myself and those around me, constantly weighing risks and planning contingencies in case things went wrong. The community was divided too, with some rallying behind our efforts and others refusing to believe the story, defending Keller's memory and casting doubt on our motives, which made the atmosphere charged and tense. As the day to publish approached, the fear of retaliation was real and palpable. But so was the hope that finally, after years of silence, justice might begin to take shape, and that the voices of the victims would at last be heard loud and clear, echoing far beyond the walls of the town Keller once called home. The day the report finally went live, everything changed in an instant. I remember sitting at my desk early that morning, his heart pounding, as Lisa uploaded the final version to the newsroom's website. The story laid bare in black and white every harrowing detail about Keller's crimes, the police cover-ups, the hidden evidence, the names of victims whose stories had been buried for far too long. Once it was out, the reactions flooded in faster than I could process messages of thanks from families who finally felt seen, grief backlash from people who couldn't believe the man they'd known was capable of such horrors, and a sudden media frenzy that swept through the town like a wildfire. The police department was forced to respond publicly, holding a press conference that was careful but tense, promising to reopen cold cases and investigate allegations of misconduct, while Keller's own past colleagues and former students were interviewed and questioned in ways that hadn't happened before. For me, the release meant everything I'd feared and hoped for rolled into one. There was relief in finally speaking the truth, but also a deep anxiety about what would come next, because threats didn't stop, and there were moments I felt watched, followed, as if the shadows Keller had left behind were still reaching out to silence us. The community was fractured, with protests erupting on one side and vigils on the other. And through it all, I kept thinking about the victims and their families, hoping that the story would bring some measure of peace or justice, but knowing that healing would be a long, difficult road. Right as the days turned into weeks, new information continued to surface. Witnesses who had been afraid to speak before came forward. Police reopened locked files, and slowly but surely, the full scope of Keller's crimes and the system that had failed to stop him began to unravel. All because one story had refused to stay hidden. Sitting in my apartment late at night, watching the news coverage and reading the messages from strangers touched by the case, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and purpose, knowing that this was far from over, but also that we'd taken the first step toward shining a light on a darkness that had haunted so many for too long. The moment the report dropped, it ignited a firestorm that couldn't be ignored. And within weeks, the authorities moved swiftly to arrest Keller, charging him with multiple counts of murder, abuse, and obstruction of justice. But what followed was a legal battle that dragged on for months and felt like a war on several fronts at once. Sitting through the pre-trial hearings and courtroom sessions, I watched as the prosecution laid out the mountain of evidence we had helped uncover. Keller's own journal, the physical evidence from the river shed, witness testimonies from people who had been too scared to speak before, the damning pattern of police negligence and cover-ups. But the defense fought hard, painting Keller as a misunderstood man and accusing us and the media of a witch hunt, trying to discredit Lisa's reporting and my involvement, turning the trial into a messy public spectacle. The community was split wide open, with some rallying behind the victims and demanding justice, while others clung desperately to the Keller they thought they knew, refusing to believe the horrifying reality which made every hearing feel charged with emotion and tension. I found myself testifying at one point, counting what Jamie and I had discovered and the steps we took to bring the truth to light. My voice shaking but steady as I faced Keller's defense attorneys trying to poke holes in my story. Outside the courtroom, protests and vigils continued, the media spotlight relentless, and the pressure mounted. But through it all, I felt a sense of purpose, that this trial was more than just about Keller. It was about exposing the failures of a system that let him thrive and demanding accountability from everyone involved. The months stretched on, and while the legal proceedings were exhausting and often painful, they also brought long overdue conversations about justice, healing, and how the community could move forward after the darkness Keller had cast for so long. As the judge finally delivered the verdict, finding Keller guilty on multiple counts, I sat quietly, overwhelmed by relief, sorrow, and the heavy knowledge that while this chapter was closing, the scars left behind would take much longer to heal. But that, at least now, the truth was out, and the victims' stories were finally heard. Now that Keller's trial is over and the verdict has been delivered, Atana feels both changed and strangely the same, like a wound that's been opened, wide but still needs time to heal. Walking through the streets, I see faces that carry a mix of relief, grief, and disbelief. People trying to reconcile the man they once knew with the dark reality we uncovered. And families of victims who finally have some answers but still carry the weight of loss no report or trial can erase. I often think back to those first days when I held those old photos and realized the places Keller had taken us weren't just random stops, but pieces of a horrifying puzzle, and how that discovery pulled me into something far bigger than I ever expected. Investigation changed my life. It made me confront fears I didn't know I had. It's taught me about the strength it takes to speak truth to power, and showed me the importance of persistence when so many would rather look away. The town has started talking more openly about what happened, and there are efforts to support the victims' families and raise awareness about how to prevent something like this in the future. But the scars remain, quiet reminders beneath the surface of everyday life. Jamie and I still keep in touch, and though those memories are painful, I'm grateful that we faced this darkness together, because it's a reminder that even in the darkest places, connection and courage can bring light. Sometimes I wonder how many other secrets like Keller's are hidden behind closed doors, okay? And whether anyone else is out there trying to uncover them quietly and carefully, piece by piece. For now, I find some peace in knowing that telling the story, sharing what happened, no matter how hard it was, has made a difference. And that, maybe, just maybe, it will help others who feel lost or silenced to find their voice. And as I prepare to close this chapter, I hope that anyone listening knows that the truth is always worth seeking, even when it's terrifying, because only by facing the shadows can we hope to live in the light. When my family and I finally moved into the old house on Maple Street, it felt like a fresh start, a chance to leave behind the chaos of our old apartment and build something new together. The house was quiet and a little worn, with creaky wooden floors and faded wallpaper that told stories of decades past. It was bigger than anything we'd had before, and I was excited to begin the renovations, imagining fresh paint, new floors, and sunlight filling every room. But even in those first days, something about the place felt off, like the house was holding its breath, waiting. I noticed small things, a sudden cold spot in the hallway, the way the floorboards would groan at odd times, and that faint, musty smell that never quite went away, no matter how much we cleaned. The crawl space under the living room was the one part of the house I rarely thought about. It was small, with a hatch that was tucked away behind the old sofa, and the contractor said it was just for storage, so we left it alone. At night, sometimes, I thought I heard soft sounds coming from down there, but I told myself it was just the house settling. Looking back now, those early moments were the calm before a storm I never could have prepared for. The house held secrets, and soon those secrets would come crashing into my life in ways I couldn't imagine, starting with the day we began that renovation, and everything changed. After we moved in and started settling, the house seemed to come alive in ways I hadn't expected, mostly at night when everything was quiet and the world outside had gone to sleep. I began to notice strange noises that didn't fit with what I thought an old house should sound like. At first, it was just little things, faint creaks and groans. It's the kind of noises you'd expect when wood and pipes adjust to new temperatures. But then, there were footsteps. Soft, slow steps that seemed to move just outside the living room, near where the crawl space hatch was hidden behind the sofa. Sometimes, it sounded like whispers, almost like someone breathing or talking very quietly. But whenever I looked, no one was there. I mentioned it to my family once, but they brushed it off, saying it was just the house settling or my imagination running wild after a long day. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air would sometimes grow cold in that part of the room, like a shadow passing through. At night, I found myself lying awake, listening to those sounds, wondering if someone or something was beneath the floorboards. I avoided the crawl space hatch, not wanting to open it or disturb whatever might be down there. The unease grew slowly, like a quiet warning whispering in the background of my mind, but I told myself I was overthinking it. Yet deep down, I knew the house held more than just old memories and dust. It held secrets waiting to be found. The renovation work moved forward steadily, with contractors and workers coming and going, tearing up old floorboards, fixing walls, and replacing the worn-out parts of the house one piece at a time. I tried to focus on the positive, imagining how the finished home would look, but the crawl space still pulled at the edges of my mind, especially since the strange noises hadn't stopped. One afternoon, as the workers were removing the old flooring in the living room, they came across something unusual, a small wooden box, locked and tucked away in the corner of the crawl space beneath the floor. It wasn't something anyone expected to find, and they called me over right away. The box looked old, covered in dust and cobwebs, with faded markings I couldn't make out. Curiosity mixed with a growing sense of dread as I looked at it, wondering what it could contain and why it was hidden down there. We didn't have a key, so the contractors carefully pried it open. Inside were strange old items, a few children's toys, some yellowed newspapers from decades ago, and then something that made my breath catch, a handful of photographs, one of which was a Polaroid that I could barely believe I was seeing. The photo was of me, as a baby, sitting in a tiny crib, looking innocent and unaware. How could that picture end up in a box beneath the floor of this house? A chill ran down my spine as I glanced around the room, suddenly aware that the house's quiet whispers were about to become a loud, terrifying secret, one that I wasn't sure I was ready to face. After the discovery of the box, I couldn't stop thinking about what might be hidden deeper in the crawlspace beneath our house. The contractors had only scratched the surface, and the photo of me as a baby held tight in that box only made me more determined to find out what was really down there. One weekend, I finally decided to open the crawlspace hatch myself. At the moment I lifted the heavy wooden panel, a cold, musty rush of air hit my face, carrying the scent of damp earth and something old, something that didn't belong. I grabbed a flashlight and crawled inside, the small space barely big enough for me to squeeze through. The walls were lined with dirt and broken bricks, and scattered across the floor were remnants of long-forgotten items, broken toys, rusted tools, and scraps of old newspapers yellowed with age. As I moved further in, my light caught on something. That made my heart stop. Bones, not just fragments, but a full human skeleton positioned in a way that looked almost deliberate. Clutched tightly in one of the skeletal hands was a faded Polaroid, and as I shone my light on it, I realized with growing horror that it was the same photo of me as a baby I'd seen in the wooden box. My breath caught in my throat, panic rising in my chest. How could my baby photo be found with a dead body buried beneath our house? How was this person, and what connection did they have to me and my family? I stumbled back out of the crawlspace, shaking, trying to make sense of the impossible truth that was unfolding beneath our very feet. The house wasn't just old. It was hiding something terrible, and now that secret was clawing its way into my life. After the discovery of the box, I couldn't stop thinking about what might be hidden deeper in the crawlspace beneath our house. The contractors had only scratched the surface, and the photo of me as a baby held tight in that box only made me more determined to find out what was really down there. One weekend, I finally decided to open the crawlspace hatch myself. The moment I lifted the heavy wooden panel, a cold, musty rush of air hit my face, carrying the scent of damp earth and something old, something that didn't belong. I grabbed a flashlight and crawled inside, the small space barely big enough for me to squeeze through. The walls were lined with dirt and broken bricks, and scattered across the floor were remnants of long-forgotten items, broken toys, rusted tools, and scraps of old newspapers yellowed with age. As I moved further in, my light caught on something. That made my heart stop. Bones, not just fragments, but a full human skeleton, positioned in a way that looked almost deliberate. Clutched tightly in one of the skeletal hands was a faded Polaroid, and as I shone my light on it, I realized with growing horror that it was the same photo of me as a baby I'd seen in the wooden box. A breath caught in my throat, panic rising in my chest. How could my baby photo be found with a dead body buried beneath our house? Who was this person, and what connection did they have to me and my family? I stumbled back out of the crawlspace, shaking, trying to make sense of the impossible truth that was unfolding beneath our very feet. The house wasn't just old, it was hiding something terrible. And now that secret was clawing its way into my life. In the days after the skeleton was discovered, my world seemed to spin out of control as I tried desperately to make sense of the impossible. The police questioned me repeatedly about my family history, but honestly, I felt like I was trapped in a fog of confusion and fear. How could a photo of me as a baby be with a dead body under my house? Was there some connection? I didn't know about some hidden part of my past that had been kept from me. I called my parents, hoping for answers, but their reactions were strange, nervous, sometimes evasive, and at other times filled with an urgency to change the subject. It only made me more suspicious. I started digging through old family albums and boxes, searching for that same photo or anything that could explain how it ended up in the crawl space, but nothing matched. The photo with the skeleton was unlike any picture I'd ever seen before. Edges, different colors, almost as if it was taken by someone else, somewhere else, in a place I couldn't remember. I felt like I was chasing shadows, pulling at threads that only seemed to unravel more questions. Sleep was difficult, and every creak or whisper in the house made my heart race. Friends and neighbors noticed my growing anxiety, but didn't know what to say, and I found myself retreating more and more into the mystery that was consuming my life. The only thing I was sure of was that the crawl space held secrets far darker than I ever imagined it. Somehow, those secrets were connected to me in a way I couldn't yet understand. When the police arrived at the house, their presence brought a strange mix of relief and fear. They moved quickly but carefully, securing the crawl space and bringing in forensic experts to examine the scene. Watching them work was surreal. They wore gloves and masks, taking photographs of every inch, measuring the space, and carefully collecting the skeleton and the Polaroid for further analysis. I stood nearby, feeling helpless but desperate for answers, my mind spinning with questions I couldn't yet voice. The lead detective, a calm but serious woman named Officer Martinez, spoke with me gently but firmly, asking about my family, the history of the house, and anything unusual I might have noticed. I repeated the story over and over, struggling to keep my voice steady, while inside I was breaking apart. Forensics began running tests, carbon dating the bones, examining the photo for fingerprints or clues, and checking the soil and dust inside the crawl space for any trace evidence. Days passed with little news, but each update brought more confusion. The skeleton was estimated to be decades old, but who was this person? How had they ended up buried under my home? And why did they hold a photo of me as a baby? As the police dug deeper, they started to look into the house's past owners and neighbors, uncovering old reports of missing people and strange events around the neighborhood. The weight of the investigation settled heavily on me. It wasn't just a case now, it was personal, and with every new piece of evidence, the shadow of the past grew larger, threatening to swallow my present. As the police worked on the forensic side, I took it upon myself to start digging into the history of the house and the neighborhood. Desperate to find any clue that could explain the chilling discovery beneath our floorboards, I spent hours in the local library, poring over old newspapers, property records, and archives, trying to piece together who had lived in the house before us and what secrets they might have left behind. What I found was unsettling. The house had changed hands several times over the past 50 years. But there was one owner whose name kept appearing in news reports linked to disappearances and unsolved crimes in the area. His name was Walter Crane, a man who had lived here during the 1970s and early 80s. And local whispers described him as a recluse with a strange obsession with children and photographs. Several children had gone missing in the neighborhood during his time here, but no charges were ever filed, and the cases eventually went cold. The police files were frustratingly thin, with many pages marked confidential or missing altogether, fueling my suspicion that something had been deliberately covered up. I also discovered that several former neighbors had moved away suddenly, and that there were rumors of late-night visitors and strange noises coming from the house in those years. The more I learned, the more the house felt like a trap holding onto dark memories. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the skeleton in the crawl space was connected to those lost children. maybe even one of Walter Crane's victims. The realization made my stomach turn. What if the Polaroid was not just a coincidence? What if my own life was tangled in this nightmare in ways I hadn't yet understood? The house, my home, was no longer just a place to live. It was a puzzle I was desperate to solve, no matter the cost. The deeper I dug into the history of the neighborhood and the chilling cases surrounding the house, the more I came across one story that stopped me cold. A report about a baby who had gone missing around the same time the skeleton was believed to have been buried. The news clippings described a frantic search for a little girl who disappeared without a trace, with the family devastated and the community gripped by fear. The baby's photo in the old articles had an eerie resemblance to me, down to the same innocent eyes and tiny features. I couldn't believe the connection, but I was too scared to ignore it. Could that missing baby be me? I started questioning everything I thought I knew about my childhood. I reached out to relatives, but most seemed unwilling to talk, brushing off my questions or changing the subject quickly. Some of the older neighbors I spoke to were hesitant, their eyes clouded with memories they didn't want to revisit. One even warned me not to dig too deep, saying some things were better left buried. My confusion turned to panic as I tried to piece together whether I was the baby from the missing persons report or if my photo had been taken without my knowledge. My parents' strange reactions suddenly made sense. Why they avoided talking about my early years. Why family albums seemed incomplete. Why I had vague memories of being in places I couldn't explain. I was chasing a shadow of my own identity, trying to find a thread of truth in a web of silence and secrets. The crawlspace skeleton and that Polaroid were not just relics of the past. They were clues pointing to a hidden chapter of my life that threatened to rewrite everything I believed about who I was. After uncovering the story of the missing baby, I began to notice small things stirring in my mind, flashes of memories that didn't quite fit with the life I thought I had lived. At times, I'd catch myself staring into space, trying to grasp a feeling or image just beyond reach, like fragments of a dream fading at dawn. There were moments when I remembered vague, disjointed conversations from my childhood, voices speaking in hushed tones, glances exchanged between adults that held unspoken meanings. I started questioning my earliest memories, the nursery I was supposed to have been in, the faces of my caregivers, even the stories my parents told me about my birth. Why were some of those memories hazy or completely missing? Why did certain names from my early years sound unfamiliar or cause discomfort when mentioned? The more I dug, the more uneasy I felt, as if my sense of self was slipping through my fingers. Nights became restless and filled with restless dreams where the crawl space appeared as a dark tunnel leading to unknown places. And shadowy figures watched me from the edges. I began to suspect that my history was more complicated and darker than I ever imagined. Was I really the baby in the missing persons report? Had my parents hidden the truth, or worse, been part of something terrible? The questions haunted me daily, and I felt torn between the desperate need to uncover the truth and the fear of what that truth might be. The house's secrets were no longer just about a skeleton and a photo. They were about me, and who I really was beneath the surface of my life, just when I felt like I was drowning in questions with no answers. I met Detective Sarah Coleman, a sharp, empathetic investigator assigned to the case who seemed to believe me from the very beginning. Unlike others who treated me as just a witness or a family member caught in the middle, Sarah listened closely to every detail I shared, no matter how strange or unsettling it sounded. She didn't dismiss the strange connection between the skeleton, the Polaroid, and my childhood, and instead encouraged me to follow my instincts, saying that sometimes the truth hides in places we're too afraid to look. Sarah shared what she knew about Walter Crane, the former owner linked to the missing children in the dark history of the house, and she was determined to uncover what had really happened decades ago. Together, we began to piece together the timeline, re-examining old police reports, missing persons files, and even reaching out to surviving neighbors who remembered Crane's strange behavior. Sarah warned me that uncovering the truth could be dangerous, that some people would prefer the past to stay buried, but she promised to stand by me no matter what. With her support, I felt a renewed strength to push forward, even as the shadows around the case grew darker and more threatening. It was the first time since discovering the skeleton that I felt like I wasn't alone and that the mystery, as terrifying as it was, could finally start to unravel. As the investigation deepened and I pushed my family for answers, tensions began to rise at home in ways I hadn't anticipated. Questions I asked were met with silence, avoidance, or defensive anger. And the warmth that once filled our house started to feel cold and strained. My parents, especially, became distant, their eyes darting away when I mentioned the crawl space or the Polaroid, and their words carried a weight of unspoken truths that made me uneasy. Old family secrets, long buried, seemed to surface in the cracks of every conversation. Stories whispered between relatives, half-forgotten details, and hints of past events no one wanted to talk about. I realized that whatever had happened years ago wasn't just a dark chapter tied to the house or the missing children. It was woven into my family's history in ways I couldn't yet fully understand. Siblings who once laughed and shared childhood memories now avoided my gaze, and relatives who had always been close suddenly pulled away, creating a growing divide. The weight of their silence was suffocating, and I found myself caught between wanting to trust them and needing to uncover the truth on my own. It became clear that the story I was unraveling wasn't just about a skeleton in a crawl space. It was about confronting the shadows lurking within my own bloodline, and realizing that some secrets could change everything we thought we knew about family, identity, and the past. Determined not to be stopped by the walls of silence and fear around me, I threw myself deeper into the investigation, working closely with Detective Coleman and following every lead, no matter how small or strange it seemed. We pored over the old photographs, including that Polaroid, searching for hidden details that might connect the skeleton to the missing children and to me. It wasn't long before we uncovered strange symbols scratched into the backs of some photos, cryptic letters, hidden in the margins of old newspapers, and notes that hinted at places tied to the killer's movements. One night, while reviewing a set of letters found in a locked drawer at the police archives, we discovered coded messages that seemed to point to a series of abandoned houses and forgotten landmarks in the neighborhood, places Walter Crane was rumored to have visited. Each clue led us further down a twisting path of secrets, a trail that wove through the dark corners of the town's history and into the heart of the nightmare that had haunted so many families for decades. As the pieces started to connect, the danger grew to strange phone calls late at night, shadows following my steps, and the unmistakable feeling that someone was watching, trying to keep the past hidden. But I couldn't stop. The crawl space skeleton and the photo of me were not coincidences. They were signs pointing toward a truth I was determined to uncover, even if it meant facing the darkest parts of my own history and the town's buried horrors. As the investigation pushed forward, and the dark pieces of the puzzle began to surface, my nights grew more restless and haunted by nightmares that felt too real to ignore. I would wake up in cold sweats, heart pounding, caught between fragments of dreams where the crawl space seemed to stretch endlessly, filled with shadowy figures, watching me silently, and flashes of that Polaroid, my innocent baby face, trapped in a world of darkness I couldn't escape. Sometimes I dreamed I was trapped beneath the floorboards, the walls closing in, skeleton reaching out with bony fingers clutching the photo, as if trying to tell me something I couldn't yet understand. These dreams bled into my waking hours, making it hard to concentrate, and fear began to creep into every part of my life. Simple sounds became threats. the creak of a floorboard, the whisper of wind outside the window, even the tick of the clock in the silence of the night. I felt like I was being watched constantly. It's a sensation that only grew when strangers began appearing in the neighborhood, asking questions I didn't want to answer. Friends and family started to notice my change, my jumpiness, my distracted gaze, but I couldn't explain the weight pressing down on me. The feeling that the house itself was alive with secrets, and that those secrets were reaching out to claim me. Despite the fear, I knew I couldn't back down. The truth was just beyond the veil of nightmares, and I had to find it, no matter what darkness awaited on the other side. Just when I thought I had reached the edge of what I could bear, the investigation took a shocking turn that would change everything I thought I knew. Detective Coleman called me late one evening with news that sent a cold wave through my body. The skeleton in the crawl space had been identified through forensic analysis as belonging to a young woman named Emily Saunders, a child who had vanished nearly 40 years ago in the very neighborhood where her house stood. But that wasn't all. Further evidence suggested that Walter Crane, former owner with a dark reputation, had been connected not only to Emily's disappearance, but to several other unsolved cases involving children. The chilling part was that Crane had an obsession with babies and photographs documented in his personal diaries that the police had finally uncovered. Reading through the pages, it became clear that he kept a twisted collection of Polaroids, each one capturing children in different stages of his crimes. And somehow, my baby photo was among them, raising terrifying questions. Had I been one of his intended victims? Was I spared? Or was there something more sinister at play? My mind raced as I struggled to comprehend the possibility that my life was tangled in the shadows of a serial killer's gruesome past. This revelation didn't just reopen wounds, it tore them wide open, forcing me to face the horrifying reality that the skeleton in our crawl space was not a random victim, but a part of a dark legacy that had somehow reached into my own story. The truth was no longer just a mystery. It was a haunting reality demanding answers, and the stakes had never been higher. With the shocking revelations weighing heavily on my heart, I knew I had to face my family and confront the past that had been buried beneath our feet for so long. The conversations were difficult. Tense silences stretched across rooms, eyes filled with fear, anger, and guilt. When I brought up Emily Saunders, Walter Crane, and the connection to the skeleton and the Polaroid, I was met with a wall of denial at first, followed by reluctant admissions. Old wounds and hidden secrets spilled out in fragment stories of adoptions that had been kept quiet. I've whispered warnings to stay silent, and hints that someone in my family might have known more than they ever let on. My parents' guarded expressions softened only when I showed them the evidence. But the truth was heavy, and the pain was clear in their eyes. It became clear that the history of the house and the crimes tied to Walter Crane weren't just dark chapters in neighborhood lore. They were entwined with my family's own story in ways I had never imagined. There were explanations about why certain memories were missing, why some family members had disappeared or distanced themselves, and why the Polaroid of me as a baby was found with Emily's skeleton. It was a revelation that shattered the foundation of everything I believed about my past and my identity. But despite the heartbreak, confronting these truths was the only way forward. We needed to face the shadows together if there was any hope of healing, understanding, and uncovering the full story behind the crawl space and the life that had been lost there. With the painful family confrontations behind me, I knew that understanding the full story meant going beyond the walls of the house and exploring the places where the darkness had once roamed freely. Accompanied by Detective Coleman, I visited old, abandoned homes on the edge of town, dilapidated structures where children were rumored to have vanished, forgotten police stations cluttered with cold case files, and local landmarks steeped in uneasy silence. Each location felt heavy with the weight of lost lives and hidden truths, the air thick with the echoes of voices long gone. At one crumbling house, I found faded drawings on the walls that matched symbols we'd seen scratched into the backs of photos connected to the case, a haunting signature of Walter Crane's twisted presence. At the police archives, dusty boxes revealed reports that had never been fully investigated. Witness statements dismissed or lost, and maps marked with secret notations that hinted at a network of crimes stretching far beyond what we'd imagined. With each step, the puzzle pieces shifted and expanded, revealing a chilling pattern of cruelty and silence that had allowed the killer to operate unchecked for years. Walking these forgotten places, I felt the weight of those lost children pressing on my soul, fueling my determination to uncover every truth, no matter how painful. The journey outside the house was as terrifying as it was necessary, a path into a past that refused to stay buried, and a reminder that the story of the skeleton in our crawl space was just one thread in a much larger, darker tapestry. As we uncovered more about Walter Crane and the terrible crimes tied to his name, it became painfully clear that the horror he inflicted went far beyond the walls of our house or even our neighborhood. His legacy was a shadow that stretched across the entire community, touching countless lives and leaving scars that time could barely heal. Families who had lost children were still grappling with unanswered questions decades later, their pain passed down through generations like a dark inheritance. There were whispers of townspeople who had seen strange figures lurking in the shadows, people who had felt the weight of fear but dared not speak up, either out of terror or distrust of those meant to protect them. As more victims came to light, the truth about how the police had handled or mishandled the investigations emerged, revealing gaps, ignored tips, and buried evidence that allowed Crane to slip through the cracks for years. The house where I now lived, once a place I thought of as safe and full of hope, is a symbol of that failure and that pain, a reminder of the darkness hidden beneath everyday life. I felt the heavy responsibility of carrying this story forward, knowing that telling the truth was the only way to honor the victims and perhaps bring some measure of peace to those haunted by the past. Walter Crane's crimes had shaped our town in ways few wanted to admit, but exposing his legacy was the first step toward healing, a chance to confront the nightmare, begin to reclaim the light. After months of digging through the past and confronting painful truths, a breakthrough finally came that began to bring some peace to the chaos that had taken over my life. The skeleton found in our crawlspace was officially identified as Emily Saunders, and the police reopened the case, dedicating new resources to uncovering the full extent of Walter Crane's crimes and bringing justice to the victims and their families. The community, once silent and fearful, began to come together, sharing stories and memories that had long been hidden in the shadows. Support groups formed, and people found comfort in knowing they were not alone in their grief and confusion. For me, the process was both painful and cathartic. I finally understood the connection between the skeleton and the Polaroid of me as a baby. And, though the truth was haunting, it allowed me to reclaim a piece of my own story. The investigation also led to renewed efforts to find any surviving victims or family members who had been impacted, offering closure where there had only been questions. Slowly, I began to feel a shift inside, a fragile hope that, despite the darkness, healing was possible. The house remained a reminder of the horrors buried beneath it, but it also stood as a symbol of resilience, truth, and the power of facing even the most terrifying past. Finding justice for Emily and the others was not just about solving a mystery. It was about restoring humanity to lives stolen too soon and allowing those left behind to finally breathe free. As the case officially closed and the dust settled on the years of fear, confusion, and painful discoveries, I found myself reflecting deeply on the journey that had brought me here, how a single moment of uncovering a skeleton in a crawl space had changed everything I thought I knew about my past, my family, and even myself. The house, once just an old building filled with creaks and shadows, had become a symbol of resilience, a place where darkness had lived, but where light was now slowly returning. The truth, as painful and haunting as it was, gave me the chance to reclaim my story and rewrite the narrative that had been buried beneath layers of silence and secrets. I've learned that sometimes the hardest truths are the ones that lead to the most healing, and that facing our fears can bring us strength we never knew we had. While scars remain and memories of those lost will always linger, there is hope in moving forward, hope in honoring the victims, in building new beginnings, and in understanding that even in the darkest places, light can find a way through. This story isn't just about a skeleton or a Polaroid. It's about confronting the past with courage, finding justice, and choosing to live with the knowledge that truth, no matter how difficult, is what ultimately sets us free.